Welcome to Seeking Tranquility in France. This is John, and I'll be reading my essay, Recalling Boys' Magazines of Yesteryear. The unashamed advertising is what lingers on in memory. Growing up, I loved to read. There were always books to explore at home. Many of them had been bought for my father when he was a child. Some of them I read over and over. I especially liked the books by Thornton W. Burgess, which told of the lives of many colorful animals who lived near the Smiling Pool and were forever teased and tested by Old Mother West Wind. Old Grandfather Frog, sitting on his lily pad, often told tales that explained the origin or the nature of things. Before beginning his stories, he would smooth his yellow waistcoat and say, "Chugarum." It also seemed that there were always a few magazines kicking around that were intended just for boys. My family didn't subscribe to them, but they found their way into our home somehow. Others were on the tables in the pediatrician's waiting room. The one I remember best was called Boy's Life. It was a publication of the Boy Scouts of America, which didn't mean much to me, but I enjoyed reading it for some of the stories, for the comics, and especially for the advertising, which is what I recall best about it. I also had an aunt who lived in Boston, and at the corner pharmacy on her block there were racks of many comic books. Whenever I'd visit, she'd give me a dime or two so I could buy one or two comic books, and over time these came to comprise a small library in her apartment. They had similar advertisements to what I'd seen in Boy's Life, and I'd read them whenever I visited. In fact, looking back, it is a bit difficult to differentiate some of the articles from the advertising. I had an interest in shortwave and amateur radio, which was stoked by the frequent articles that made it sound exotic and interesting. I also spent time looking at the radio equipment that was advertised, brands with intriguing names like Hallicrafters, dreaming of one day actually owning such a thing. Other products and services that were advertised made a big impression too. A testimony, I suppose, to the ability of advertising to imprint upon the minds of children. Some ads appeal to boys' desire to be manly or just to grow up faster. For example, I remember an ad that seemed to appear in every issue that proclaimed, "You can have a He-Man voice." It depicted an adult male with a smug expression, a coy half-smile, and a strong jaw, holding a telephone receiver to his ear and speaking into the mouthpiece. A lad might have imagined that there was a young woman at the other end of the line, swooning over his deep, mellifluous tones. It did not occur to me that it would have been utterly incongruous to have instead shown an awkward boy of 10 or 11 on the phone, or even face-to-face with someone, speaking in their newly acquired He-Man baritone, even though the prepubescent boy was the target audience for this ad. It's still not clear to me what would happen if one wrote to the Perfect Voice Institute, which sponsored the ad. That appeal to manliness was also in play with ads that had to do with physical development. These also played on boys' insecurities with regard to bullies. We used to call bodybuilders muscle men, and Charles Atlas, real name Angelo Siciliano, was perhaps the best known among him. At least his advertising was effective in reaching my age group. Sometimes the ad was like a comic strip, wherein a scrawny lad named Mac would be humiliated at the beach by a bully kicking sand in his face. The humiliation was amplified by the sight of his girlfriend looking on. Mac would then buy Atlas's bodybuilding course, transform from a pathetic weakling into a muscle man, and wreak revenge upon the bully. This is the one ad that I actually responded to. I wrote to the address given, and to my chagrin, learned from the reply that it was too costly for my non-existent budget, something like $29 or $35, so I gave up on it. Mr. Atlas did not give up on me, however, and in the weeks following I got letter after letter making a final offer at ever lower discounted prices. When it reached $5, I scraped together 5 $1 notes, stuffed them into an envelope and sent it off, and soon thereafter a package arrived with the entire course, a copy of a typescript with a progressive set of exercises for each of many weeks. I looked through the stack of paper and came to the final bonus chapter, which was entitled The True Tonic of Life. In Massachusetts at the time, we called carbonated soft drinks tonics, but this was something different and horrible. The true tonic of life in Mr. Atlas's view of the world was an enema. An enema! After reading that chapter, I wanted nothing more to do with bodybuilding. Some of the advertising spoke to boys' interest in pets. Sea monkeys were often promoted, though the sponsors were careful not to disclose that these creatures were not monkeys at all. Rather, they were brine shrimp, or artemia, though you'd not guess that from the illustrations in the ad. What you saw instead were figures that resembled humanoids with antennae, similar to how Martians were depicted in cheap creature feature films, smiling and happily socializing with each other. The text reinforced this anthropomorphic notion, suggesting they could be trained, that they played with each other and performed stunts, etc. It took a careful reading, uncharacteristic of the target clientele, to realize that what would come to you in the mail were some shrimp eggs that you had to drop into an aquarium and hope that they would hatch. I imagine there were very few repeat customers. Sea monkeys never really interested me, but I did find the darling pet monkey intriguing. The ad showed a small monkey sitting contentedly in the palm of a human hand. In some manifestations, I was wearing a little jacket. These were actual squirrel monkeys, which are native to Central and South America, and they were offered for $18.95 from Animal Farm in Miami Beach. They were said to be easy to train, and that they ate the same food as humans, including lollipops. There were also several things the ad did not mention, namely, that squirrel monkeys can live up to 20 years, that to keep cool they habitually rub their fur and tail with their own urine, and that they can give a nasty bite. I actually knew someone who had purchased a darling pet monkey. She lived near to us in Connecticut, and her brother rode on my school bus and often spoke of it. He was one of those boys who always wore black pointed shoes with white socks. He filled his hair with Brill cream or Vaseline hair tonic and combed it straight back, forming a razor-sharp DA, or duck's ass, at the back of his head. At age 14, he also smoked cigarettes in the back seat of the bus. He was an example of the genre of boy called a hood. In Massachusetts, where we'd lived previously, we'd have said greaser. He had many stories to tell, most of which were boastful, distasteful, or mean-spirited. One day he described with glee the consequences of feeding his sister's darling pet monkey a popular chocolate-flavored laxative product. The poor monkey. Marketers are also aware, of course, that boys eventually grow out of their sea monkey and darling pet monkey phase when hormones start to direct their attention elsewhere. What could be better to satisfy a lad's growing interest in the lassies than X-ray specs? These ads invariably depicted a leering male, adorned with glasses whose lenses were decorated with a spiral motif, observing a young woman whose curvaceous silhouette was visible beneath the outline of her clothing. Boys I knew sometimes joked about having X-ray specs, but none of us actually believed they'd work. Then there were hobbies, like the shortwave and amateur radio advertisements I already mentioned. Music was another hobby that was promoted by advertising. There always seemed to be an advertisement for an accordion. I think, however, that most were beyond the financial reach of a boy, and were accordingly written in part for parents who wanted their children to do something more productive than read magazines and comic books. Some even advertised monthly payment plans. Accordions were probably a hard sell to that population of boys more interested in weaponry. There were plenty of products available for that cohort as well. Knives of all sorts, especially genuine Bowie knives. Most boys I knew also sincerely wanted a Daisy air rifle, ads for which were ubiquitous. Like accordions, they had a cost issue and perhaps an appropriateness issue that called for parental approval. The manufacturer was aware of this and suggested that boys ask Dad. He had one. My mother would always assert that they were dangerous. You could put someone's eye out with that thing, she'd say. There were advertisements for the business-minded boy, too, perhaps older boys, or the offspring of some captain of industry who wanted to grow up and be just like Dad. My brother was one of those boys who in early adolescence began to dream about becoming a great entrepreneur. I recall at one point when rummaging through family papers coming across a school essay he'd written about the woods in our neighborhood, which began something like, "The forests near our home are a source of fun and profit." So this business-oriented thinking started early on. One day he spoke to me about a terrific idea he'd picked up from a magazine, the raising of rabbits for food. He already had the business name, Howard's Rabbitry. I don't recall the sources, but he seemed to have a lot of information about the value of rabbit meat and how to sell it to make big money. I'd never even thought about eating rabbit. After all, my pet was a large white New Zealand giant with big red eyes called Thumper. Eventually, he replaced this idea with another that was provoked by advertising, albeit from an ad that might not have been directed exclusively at boys, selling Mason shoes. At that time, in the 1960s, door-to-door salesmen were still relatively common. I recall visits from several of them. The Fuller Brush man came by regularly, and my mother often bought something from him. We also had longer visits from a man selling subscriptions to the Encyclopedia Britannica, and another from somebody selling a fire alarm system. He had a model of a 2-story house that would appear to burst into flame when he reached the climax of his presentation. I also recall a vacuum cleaner salesman dumping a pile of dirt onto one of my grandmother's hand-braided rugs and then dispatching it with his Hoover, but no sale. The Avon woman visited regularly too, and she outlasted all of the others. So the concept of selling Mason shoes door-to-door was not that far-fetched. You could send away for a salesman kit with samples, but first you had to apply for a certificate of authorization that would prove to potential customers that you were a bona fide company representatives. Well, things never got that far. Perhaps offsetting the advertisements seeking to lure young men into the world of work and capitalism were those that were more spiritual in orientation. I was particularly struck by an ad that ran with the headline, "A Split Second in Eternity." It portrayed what looked like Jesus on the cross, except that the cross seemed to be lying on the ground, and a ghostly outline of a featureless man stood in the background surrounded by some kind of aura. The ad, placed by the Rosicrucians, appeared to be religious, or at least spiritual, and seemed somewhat out of place in the ephemeral publications that boys of the time liked to read. What would a 10-year-old make of a sentence like this? "The shackles of the body, its earthly limitations, can be thrown off, and man's mind can be attuned to the infinite wisdom for a flash of a second." It went on to explain that this is what the ancients called cosmic consciousness. I hadn't thought a lot about any of this until I watched the 1984 film Repo Man much later, when a character called Miller speaks about coincidences, saying, "Suppose you're thinking about a plate of shrimp. Suddenly, someone will say plate, or shrimp, or plate of shrimp out of the blue, no explanation. No point in looking for one either. It's all part of the cosmic unconsciousness." So, was Miller a Rosicrucian? As I reflect on how my brain has retained all of this nonsense, channeled into my mind through advertising in boys' magazines and comic books long ago, I think of a quote from another film I saw in adolescence, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore's Bedazzled from 1967. A character in the film, a dejected worker in a British hamburger joint, strikes a bargain with the devil, accepting 7 wishes in exchange for his soul. But the devil is not wholly successful, and at one point becomes dissatisfied with his once keen ability to induce people to sin. He complains, "Take the 7 deadly sins. I thought those up in one afternoon. The only thing I've come up with lately is advertising." Somehow this explains why I remember the ads in all those old magazines and comic books written for boys. Thanks for listening.